Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. A tragic murder, a wrongful conviction, and a mystery that took nearly 4 decades to solve. This is the haunting legacy of the Christine Jessop case. In the quiet town of Queensville, Ontario, the disappearance of a 9-year-old girl in 1984 shattered the community and captured national attention. Archival footage of faded newspaper headlines and somber aerial shots of the rural town set the stage, underscoring the innocence lost and the questions left unanswered. Childhood photos of Christine's smiling, vibrant, aware of what fate would bring, remind viewers of the human life at the heart of this tragedy. As time passed, the case became emblematic of the flaws in Canada's justice system. An innocent man guy, Paul Morin, was wrongfully convicted based on flawed forensics and investigative bias, exposing deep-rooted issues that would later lead to major reforms. The revelation, nearly 40 years later, of the real killer through advanced DNA technology not only brought long-awaited answers, but also reignited public dialogue about justice, truth, and the painful cost of error. This video revisits the twists and turns of a case that changed Canadian criminal justice forever, compelling viewers to confront how such mistakes can happen and how they must be prevented. Asterisk. In the months following the discovery of Christine Jessop's body, police faced intense pressure to find her killer. Their focus eventually turned to a seemingly unlikely suspect, Guy Paul Morin, the quiet, soft-spoken young man who lived next door to the Jessop family. Morin, a 24-year-old musician and factory worker, was known for his eccentric behavior, an introverted nature. He played the clarinet, kept to himself, and had few social connections in the neighborhood. 2 investigators. His odd mannerisms and proximity to Christine's home made him stand out. The case against Morin wasn't built on physical evidence, but rather on suspicion and circumstance. His daily routine placed him in the area the day Christine disappeared, and police interpreted his aloof demeanor as potentially suspicious. Investigators used these behavioral quirks, his quietness, his solitary habits, and what they called an unusual lifestyle, as circumstantial indicators of guilt. Despite the lack of direct evidence linking him to the crime scene, Morin was arrested and charged with Christine's murder in 1985. His first trial ended in an acquittal. The prosecutors appealed, and in 1992, after a second trial, Morin was convicted. The conviction was largely based on flawed forensic science and questionable testimony. The public, desperate for closure, was led to believe that justice had been served. But doubts lingered both within the legal community and among those who closely followed the case. In 1995, those doubts were confirmed. Advances in DNA testing finally revealed that the biological evidence found on Christine's body did not match Morin. He was completely exonerated, and the justice system was forced to admit a grave mistake. An official apology followed along, with a public inquiry into what went wrong. For Guy Paul Morin, the consequences were life-altering. He spent years under suspicion and endured imprisonment for a crime he didn't commit. The emotional toll was immense. His mental health suffered, and he lived with the trauma of being branded a child killer. Public perception of him shifted. Only slowly, and even after his name was cleared, the stigma lingered. Legally, he received financial compensation, but no amount of money could restore the years lost or undo the damage inflicted on his life. His case became one of the most powerful examples of wrongful conviction in Canadian history, exposing systemic flaws in law enforcement and forensic science that would change investigative practices nationwide. Asterisk. Decades. After Christine Jessop's murder, hope for justice remained dim. But scientific progress would ultimately do what traditional investigations could not: identify her killer. The breakthrough came through advances in DNA technology, specifically in the field of genealogy, which had already revolutionized cold case investigations across North America. In the years following Guy Paul Morin's exoneration, the biological evidence collected from Christine's body had been preserved. Forensic science had evolved dramatically since the 1980s and 1990s. By 2020, the techniques available were far more precise and powerful. Investigators turned to genealogy, a cutting-edge method that combines DNA analysis with publicly available family tree data. This approach had already solved cases like the Golden State Killer in the United States and was now being applied. In Canada, using preserved DNA from the original crime scene, forensic experts created a detailed genetic profile of the unknown perpetrator. That profile was uploaded to genealogical databases, allowing scientists to search for familial matches or relatives, whose DNA was similar enough to suggest a common ancestor. It was through this technique that they identified a relative of Calvin Hoover, a man who had died by suicide in 2015. Hoover had been a casual acquaintance of the Jessop family in the 1980s. He had attended social gatherings and was even known. To Christine's mother, Janet, at the time, he was never considered a suspect. But in 2020, investigators confirmed through further DNA testing that Hoover's profile was an exact match to the sample found on Christine's body. This discovery closed one of Canada's most painful and high-profile cold cases. While Hoover could no longer face justice in a courtroom, confirmation of his identity brought long-awaited answers to Christine's family and vindication for Paul Morin. The use of genetic genealogy marked a turning point, not just in this case, but in how cold cases in Canada might be solved in the future. It was a stark reminder that truth, though sometimes delayed, can be uncovered through science and persistence. Calvin Hoover was not a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was someone who had once been welcomed into the Jessop family's circle. In the early 1980s, Hoover and his wife were casual friends of Christine Jessop's parents. They had attended barbecues and social gatherings together, and Christine likely knew him as just another adult in her family's extended network. At the time of the murder, Hoover was in his early 30s and lived in the area, but he was never seriously investigated or considered a suspect by police. Looking back, certain behavioral patterns raise unsettling questions. While there were no public reports of criminal behavior during his lifetime, some people who knew Hoover later described him as having a controlling personality and a temper. These details, though vague, have been interpreted in retrospect as possible red flags, subtle signs that something darker might have been lurking beneath the surface. However, without a criminal record or documented history of violence, nothing about him stood out enough to warrant suspicion at the time. In 2015, Calvin Hoover died by suicide. He left behind no confession or clear explanation, and his death initially passed with little public notice. But after the 2020 DNA breakthrough identified him as Christine's killer, his suicide took on new meaning.
Ow.
While there's no conclusive evidence that his death was directly connected to guilt over the crime, it has fueled speculation. Some believe that as DNA technology advanced and cold cases began to be reopened, Hoover may have feared the inevitable, knowing that the truth would eventually catch up to him. Hoover's identification as the perpetrator brought long-awaited closure to the Jessop case, but it also opened new wounds. For Christine's family and for the public, the revelation that her killer had been close all along and had escaped justice in life was a bitter truth. It underscored just how fragile trust can be and how, in some cases, the real danger lies far closer than anyone imagines. The 2020 revelation that Calvin Hoover was the real killer in Christine Jessop's case triggered an emotional and complex wave of reactions across Canada. For the Jessop family, the breakthrough was both a relief and a heartbreak. For decades of uncertainty, they finally had an answer, but it came too late for true justice. Christine's mother, Janet Jessop, expressed deep sorrow that the man responsible had died years earlier and would never face accountability in a courtroom. The news reopened old wounds, but also brought an end to the painful question of who had taken Christine's life. For Paul Morin and his family, the identification of Hoover was a moment of vindication, but also of reflection on all that had been lost. Morin issued a public statement through Innocence Canada, expressing gratitude that the truth had finally emerged, but emphasizing the devastating toll the wrongful conviction had taken on his life. He spoke of years filled with fear, shame, and emotional trauma, experiences that no apology or breakthrough could ever erase. The public and media response was swift and passionate.
Outrage
erupted over the systemic failures that had led to Morin's conviction. Commentators and citizens alike demanded accountability. Not just for the wrongful arrest, but for the years the real killer had been free. Sympathy poured in for Morin, whose ordeal became a symbol of the devastating consequences of a flawed justice system. There was also a broader sense of national reckoning, an uncomfortable reminder of how the rush to solve a crime can blind investigators to the truth. In the days that followed the DNA revelation, official apologies were issued. The Ontario Provincial Police and other agencies involved in the original investigation publicly acknowledged their errors. Government officials expressed regret and pledged to learn from the case. Innocence Canada, the organization that had long advocated for Morin, used the moment to call for continued reforms in forensic practices, investigative procedures, and accountability measures. The Jessop case became more than just a cold case solved. It became a lesson etched into the history of Canadian law enforcement. A reminder that justice must be pursued carefully, with humility and vigilance, or it risks causing even more harm. Christine Jessop case stands as a powerful and painful lesson in the consequences of getting it wrong. Paul Morin's wrongful conviction exposed how easily the justice system can fail when it relies too heavily on circumstantial evidence and subjective interpretation. His case became a landmark example in Canada, raising national awareness about wrongful convictions and the lifelong damage they cause, not only to the innocent person accused, but also to the victims and families still waiting for real justice. One of the most striking takeaways is the danger of building a case on assumptions, behavioral profiling, and weak forensic evidence. Morin was targeted not because of hard proof, but because he seemed odd, lived nearby, and didn't fit the mold of what investigators considered normal. These subjective judgments, compounded by tunnel vision and confirmation bias, led to years of pain and a conviction based on little more than flawed logic. The eventual breakthrough, achieved through DNA evidence and modern forensic science, highlighted how crucial scientific accuracy is in criminal investigations. Had today's DNA testing existed in the 1980s, the case against Morin would have never gone to trial. It reinforced the need to preserve evidence and invest in evolving technologies that can uncover the truth with precision rather than speculation. Equally important is the urgent call for police accountability and bias reduction. The rush to close a high-profile case, combined with investigative shortcuts and poor oversight, allowed confirmation bias to take hold and blind the system too. Alternative suspects like Calvin Hoover, who had been in plain sight, the case prompted reforms, including stronger checks on police conduct, improvements in forensic standards, and the broader use of third-party reviews in controversial cases. In the end, the tragedy of Christine Jessop's murder was deepened by the injustice that followed, but her story on Morensby became a catalyst for change, reminding the public and the legal system that justice isn't just about solving a case, it's about ensuring the right person is held accountable. Using evidence, not instinct, and always with fairness at its core, the Christine Jessop case and the wrongful conviction of Paul Morin has left a lasting imprint on Canadian culture and the country's legal system. Over the years, the story has been revisited in documentaries, podcasts, and news specials, drawing attention not only to the tragic loss of a young girl, but also to the profound failures of the justice system. Productions such as CBC's Fifth Estate, the Uncover podcast series, and various true crime documentaries have examined the case in depth, exposing the public to the emotional, legal, and investigative dimensions of the decades-long saga. These media explorations helped keep the case alive in public memory and contributed to the broader discourse on justice reform in Canada. The impact of the case extended far beyond headlines. It directly influenced changes in Canadian law and criminal justice procedures. The Kaufman Commission, launched after Morin's exoneration, led to sweeping recommendations aimed at preventing future miscarriages of justice. These included reforms to police interviewing techniques, forensic evidence handling, and the importance of disclosure by prosecutors. The case also played a significant role in the strengthening of organizations like Innocence Canada, which now work to free the wrongfully convicted and advocate for systemic change. Paul Morin emerged from this ordeal not just as a survivor of injustice, but as a powerful symbol of the need for legal reform. Though deeply affected by his experience, Morin's story has inspired new generations of lawyers, activists, and legal scholars to question assumptions, demand accountability, and prioritize evidence over prejudice. His name is now closely associated with justice reform in Canada, a reminder of what can happen when the system fails, and how critical it is to learn from those failures. Ultimately, the legacy of the Christine Jessop case is not just about solving a mystery. It's about how a wrongful conviction changed the course of Canadian legal history, elevated public awareness of systemic flaws, and gave rise to a national conversation about truth, fairness, and the pursuit of real justice. The Christine Jessop case remains one of the most heartbreaking and important stories in Canadian criminal history. It exposed the devastating consequences of a wrongful conviction, the limits of flawed investigations, and the critical role that forensic science and accountability must play in the pursuit of justice. Nearly 4 decades after her tragic death, Christine's story and guy Paul Morin's fight to clear his name continues to remind us that justice must never be rushed, and the truth must never be assumed. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think went wrong in this case? And with today's technology and safeguards, could something like this still happen again? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this story powerful or important, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this video. These conversations matter, and the more we talk about them, the more we can push for the change needed to protect the innocent and honor the truth.